This is part 3 of my mini-series covering the making of area terrain pieces, hills, built-up areas and woods of a higher quality than you would normally expect on a plain area. Originally I intended this to be a single video, then split it into two, and now I've created a third part. And the primary reason is that as I started working on it, more and more interesting ideas came up that I wanted to add to the video. The main purpose really is all about providing players with a bunch of ideas and hints and thoughts on how they could potentially create better looking playing areas which are still player friendly. In this video I will mainly be focusing on built up areas. While I must admit I normally use my balsa wood flat topped built up areas in games, originally I used actual 6mm models of buildings. I think I will end up using 1 in 1000 scale buildings as my built-up area as a compromise solution, but I've not received any of this scale building yet, so I will not cover them and only cover the 6mm buildings. There are benefits with using 6mm and there are disadvantages, and we'll discuss all of these in this video. The biggest issue with building models, particularly 6mm models, is that while they certainly can look good, especially when you have a lot of them together, they can move around on the playing area if the table is bumped, and when you actually want to occupy that built-up area with an element, they have to be removed. So as a result, you need to think about what kind of solution to overcome these disadvantages, and this video will cover one solution. Actually, it's the most commonly used solution. However, in my case, I'm trying to make this particular type of solution look as good as possible. Now, the actual method that I use is that the built-up area is actually made up of two separate segments or pieces. The actual built-up area base, which you can see in this video, is at the bottom, which is the sort of rocky, granity type base, and the building which actually fits on top of it. When you need to fight in the built-up area, you remove the building. Then when the built-up area no longer has elements in it, then you can place the building back on it. It's a good compromise solution, and many players use this, although in most cases the bases are more basic and the buildings move around quite a bit on it. But nonetheless, this is a solution. This shows the smallest built-up area that I use in a game using these models. It happens to be a 4cm square base with a model on it of a building which is based on a 3cm square base. Now, there is one issue with this kind of building scale, and that is, while it matches the figures you have on the playing area, it does not match the ground scale. As a result, your village ends up basically consisting of a single building, which, can look okay, I suppose, but does look a little bit odd. So as a result, this is my smallest built-up area, which really consists of one building and represents a village of probably 10 or 20 smaller buildings and a population of about 100. The next size up is a 6cm square base, which in this case normally accommodates a building which is 4cm in length and 3cm wide. Even at this size, it's hard to put more than one building on it. I also have a 9cm square, 12cm square and one huge 24cm square base. These bases accommodate more than one building on them, and the largest ones have a road running through them. I was toying with the idea of making a full diorama, but unfortunately it's basically too inflexible for play. That is, if you create a diorama, it becomes very difficult to place actual gaming elements on it. All my buildings have a thin felt base, so when they're placed on the built-up area base, they stay firmly in place. This is a bit of an optional thing, but does stop your building flying around if someone bumps the table. Incidentally, some of the buildings here actually have a resin base, and even for these I place a thin layer of felt to ensure it doesn't move around. What is far more important is that the actual built-up area base has a layer of felt on it. But this means that when it's placed on a flocked playing area, it stays firmly in place even if the playing area is bumped. As with all my MDF pieces, the edges are rounded and smoothed around to try and make it merge in with the playing area. I normally spray the bases and glue woodland fine ballast onto it. I'm not 100% happy with this, but until I find a better alternative, that is what I will stay with. Adding a piece of felt under both the building and also the base does add some height, but as long as you keep the felt as thin as possible and the colour matches the playing area, it generally is not noticeable. This shows an example of my largest built-up area, in this case 24 square centimetres, with buildings on it. While I do like these diorama type pieces, I must admit rarely ever using it, both because of its size, complexity to set up, and also most of my games really don't cover urban conflicts. This shows a top-down view of my built-up area. All the buildings can be moved around as required when fighting occurs in the built-up area. I only ever used this once, and while I had it well defended with infantry, my opponent basically ignored it or avoided it and still won the game. It was then I realised that unless you are fighting a specific urban battle scenario, large built-up areas tended to be ignored or bypassed, as they would probably in an actual mobile situation. As with my other built-up areas, the built-up area is felt-based, so stays firmly on the playing area. The buildings on it are also felt-based, so they stay firmly on the built-up area base. The MDF board is sloped at the edges and covered with woodland ballast, in this case 2 colours. The roads are a bit of an option, and I do vary my roads a little bit. Some of the bases have 1 centimetre wide roads, some 2 centimetres, some 3, but I attempt, or at least I did with this large base, to ensure that it aligned up with actual roads. The reason why I normally have 3 centimetre base or roads here is that it allows me to move my elements through it without me needing to shift my buildings around. I have been greatly influenced by playing areas such as this, which I personally feel is magnificent. Additional information concerning this diorama or built-up area can be found at hellletloose.co.uk. The URL is listed at the end of the video as well as on this screen at the top. Unfortunately, it's not very visible. However, alas, I will need to be satisfied with my little old 24 square centimetre playing area, as a diorama of this nature is only valuable if you're actually fighting a urban conflict and the ground scale matches the building and figure scales, which normally doesn't occur if you're refighting using a platoon or company scale set of rules. Even squad is a little bit of a stretch, although you could possibly push that in. Now, this is very much almost at the skirmish scale. While I'm not covering this in any great detail in this video, I personally believe 1/1000 scale buildings are possibly the best actual solution, as you can see here. Based correctly, you should be able to place elements on top of these figures, thus allowing for good-looking terrain and no need to move the buildings out of the way when you actually move elements into the built-up area. Once I receive my 1/1000 scale building models and paint and base them, I'll find out if my guess is correct or not, and I certainly hope this will work, because my most practical terrain is my balsa wood terrain, and quite frankly it don't look really good, and my better looking terrain, which is the 6mm buildings, are simply too fiddly to use. And while the buildings themselves look good, it does look a little bit odd because of the scale mismatch. The ground scale is 1 in 10,000 or even 1 in 5,000. The buildings are basically 1 in 300 scale, and that becomes a little bit obvious. For woods, that is this kind of quality woods, I use woodland coarse turf, or their coarser version of turf, which is underbrush, on top of one of my area terrain pieces. This is a test run piece. I need to spray a solution of diluted PVA glue on this. The elements can simply be placed on top of this base. I'm using this with my 1 in 1000 scale buildings, or intend to use them. If I use my 6mm buildings, I tend to use a felt piece on the playing area with lichen on top of that. This shows a completed woods area terrain piece, in this case 12 centimetres square, which is my most common woods area terrain piece size. I also use rectangles, normally 12 centimetres long with either 6 or 9 centimetres wide, and they're quite useful as well. And of course I have created just a few very edge or flank type woods terrain pieces that are basically 30.5 centimetres or 12 inches in length, which I use to close off a flank if I don't have a stream there, or if I decide I don't want to use my hills, which we'll see later. The elements are simply placed on top of this terrain piece. They fit quite well and there's no particular issue with it. As with all my terrain pieces, the base has felt on it, so it stays firmly in place on the playing area. This shows a close-up. In this case I'm using Woodland's underbrush, of which I normally have two colours, so I have two colours of woods, light green and olive green. I will get dark green as well to get a third colour, and that's primarily because I normally have three types of woods, in theory anyway. Creating this is rather tricky, as you need to first prepare an MDF area terrain piece with flock on top of it, as you would a hill. You can see a hill in the background, which is what the woods area terrain piece looked like before I applied the underbrush flock. You now apply a thick layer of PVA glue to this area terrain piece over the flock. Unlike the fine turf, which only needs a very thin layer of glue, this needs a lot of glue for the underbrush to stick correctly. You then spread the underbrush over this, lightly pressing down the underbrush onto the base and then adding some more on top. I leave to dry for 24 hours. I normally leave it to dry in a plastic box, and then using a dry brush, lightly brush off the unwanted underbrush flock. Make sure you do not remove too much and ensure the edges go beyond the edges of the MDF board, as you see here. Now you give it a very liberal spray of watered down PVA glue. Ensure the density of the solution is not too watered down. I ensure a 50-50 solution in this case. Once it has dried, the underbrush should remain glued to your MDF board. I must admit, bits will come off, so this may leave a bit of a mess after using it for the first few times, but eventually all the very loose underbrush does fall off, from keeping the stuff that's firmly stuck to your MDF board. In addition to actual woods, I also create minor foliage terrain, such as wheat fields. A wheat field could provide observation cover for troops on foot, although would be less than useful for vehicles. In this case, I use smaller area terrain pieces, normally 9 centimetres square, and covered with Woodland's coarse turf. This shows an example of my wheat field. I'm not really happy with this, as it probably looks more like a lot of a brush rather than a wheat field. So I'm looking at using static grass for this type of terrain in future. Woodland offers about 6 different types of coarse turf. In the foreground is an olive green or perhaps light green field. I've also 1 9 centimetres square of each of these 6 colours, and find that's all I normally require to depict fields which have an effect on the game. I actually rarely use more than 1 or 2 in any particular game. Here's an example of 2 more different coloured coarse turf terrain pieces. One point I wish to make is road alignment. My built-up areas pieces on the left uses 3 centimetre wide roads. This is to allow me to place elements in it without needing to move houses if they're just moving through. The road needs to align with the playing area road, or it should align anyway. I have smaller built-up areas with 2 centimetre wide roads and 1 centimetre wide roads, but I find it hard to line up with the roads on the playing area sometimes when using particularly 1 centimetre wide roads. This is not really that important, but it does help to enhance your playing area so it looks a bit closer to a diorama. For hills, I use my rounded edge area terrain pieces, flocked and with a felt base. The edges need to be painted green. Unfortunately, as you can see here, they're not, and it's something I'll have to go back and correct. But otherwise, matches the base terrain, or at least it needs to match the base terrain, in order to give it a more seamless effect. In this example, you see a 2-layered hill. This is one of my early hills where I used wood putty to give me the second layered slope. My current hills all have the slope grinded into the MDF layer, which I find easier as I now use a battery-powered drill with a grinding bit to do this. This rather blurry picture shows the slope. One thing I did discover while making hills was almost all hills are really only one layer, and I only possess 4 to 5 two-layer hills using a 12 centimetre square base. My flank ridge hills are the exception. They are 3 layers, but I only use them to define the flank, and rarely does anyone go up the hill to fight it out. Normally there's no need. It's difficult to see, but you'll notice the base of the hill has a layer of dark green felt. The felt I use match the green I use for my flock, as well as it being very thin. This type of terrain is designed to look as realistic as possible, so you need to expend a lot of effort in ensuring the felt is as invisible as possible. The reason why I use a felt base is to prevent the hills moving around. In Macbeth, the forest can move around, but no hills were moving, and thus you need to make sure the terrain stays firmly in place in order to make Shakespeare happy. One area which did catch me out was how easy it was to accidentally leave bare patches. This is a major issue if you spray the terrain piece a green which looks similar to the flock, which means it's easy to miss. I'll probably go back and place some flock in these spots, but if the terrain was coloured light green, these patches would be easy to see and thus corrected when you sprayed the terrain with a watered down solution of PVA glue. As it is, I only noticed it in this photograph. On the other hand, the counter-argument is if you use this kind of paint and you do miss it, then you don't need to go back and correct it because really it's not very noticeable. Anyway, players can decide if they want to be perfect or just good enough. This top-down image shows some of the common sizes I use for hills. As you can see, the top left corner is a 9 centimetre square. Going further to the right, you see a 9 by 6. If you go down, you see a 2-layered hill, the bottom layer being 12 centimetre square, and the top right corner is a 12 centimetre length with a 9 centimetre depth, and well, actually that could be 6 centimetre depth, sorry. And if you go further down, that's the same, but with a 9 centimetre depth. I mentioned earlier in the videos, I do have 3-layer hills which I use on the flank, and this shows a very close-up example of one. In this image, you'll see 3-layer hill. In this case, the hill is considered as rough, so I have placed a higher concentration of brown in it to make it a little bit more obvious as distinct from the normal playing area terrain. As most of my games are 3 feet wide by 4 feet deep, I normally create 4 of these for each of my playing area, each of which is 12 inches long and which can join together as seamlessly as possible. This allows me to cover an entire flank of hills. Personally, if I did this again, I would not use so much brown on the lower slope. In future, I would use more green so it more seamlessly merges in with the playing area terrain. In this case, it looks a little bit too obvious that it doesn't really match very well with the base terrain, unfortunately. On the other hand, this should match very well with my other playing area terrain, which uses the brown base from Woodland. This concludes my 3-part mini-series on creating area terrain, and also contains some information on creating the actual playing area tiles. Denken Sie daran, immer für Hill heimatlichen zu kämpfen.